He left her when she needed him most. Now she's cleaning tables at his wedding. Pregnant. And carrying the truth he tried to leave behind. This is one of the stories they never want told. Click subscribe and hear them all. The crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the ballroom of the St. Regis Atlanta, where 200 of the city's most influential people celebrated what the society pages would call the wedding of the year. Darius Kingsley adjusted his platinum cufflinks and surveyed the scene. Politicians mingling with tech moguls, old money mixing with new, everyone dressed in their finest and speaking in the polished tones of people who had never known real struggle. He should have felt triumphant. At 34, he was the founder and CEO of PropTech Solutions, a real estate technology firm that had revolutionized how commercial properties were bought and sold across the Southeast. His net worth had crossed 8 figures 2 years ago. Today he'd married Alina Hartwell, daughter of Georgia's senior senator, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her political connections and family wealth. Everything was perfect. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? "Darius, honey, come meet the Ashfords." Alina called from across the room, her voice carrying that particular blend of sweetness and command that had first attracted him to her. She stood near the bar in her custom Vera Wang gown, every inch the senator's daughter, surrounded by a cluster of admirers, hanging on her every word about their honeymoon plans in the Maldives. He nodded and started toward her, weaving through conversations about market trends and political fundraisers, accepting congratulations with the practiced smile he'd perfected over years of networking events. But something made him pause near the dessert table where the wedding cake, a 4-tier masterpiece decorated with sugar peonies, stood like a monument to excess. A flash of movement caught his eye. One of the catering staff was quietly clearing glasses from a nearby table, her movements efficient and unobtrusive. Something about her posture, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, made his breath catch. He knew that gesture. He'd watched it 1,000 times. The woman straightened, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and he saw her profile clearly. The elegant curve of her neck, the determined set of her shoulders, the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the black catering uniform. Asha. Time seemed to fracture. The laughter and conversation around him faded to white noise. His vision tunneled until there was nothing but her. Asha Blake, his ex-wife, 6 months pregnant, and clearing tables at his wedding reception. She must have sensed his stare, because she turned her dark eyes meeting his across the crowded room. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other. Her face showed no surprise, no anger, just a weary resignation that cut through him like a blade. Then she turned away, picked up her tray of glasses, and walked toward the kitchen with the same quiet dignity she'd carried through their entire marriage, even during its painful end. Darius stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Around him the party continued. His party, his perfect wedding to his perfect wife in his perfect new life. But all he could see was Asha's face, the exhaustion in her eyes, the careful way she'd moved to protect the child growing inside her. The child that, given the timing, might very well be his. "There you are." Alina appeared at his elbow, linking her arm through his. "The photographer wants to get some shots of us cutting the cake before." "Darius? Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He managed to find his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "I'm fine. Just overwhelmed by it all." Alina beamed, misunderstanding entirely. "I know, isn't it wonderful? Everything's absolutely perfect." She squeezed his arm. "Come on, let's go make some memories." As she led him toward the cake, Darius caught a glimpse of the kitchen doors swinging shut. Somewhere beyond them, Asha was continuing her work, invisible to the celebrating guests, carrying whatever secrets and struggles had brought her to this moment. Perfect, he thought bitterly. Everything was absolutely perfect. Chapter 2. What they don't know: 3 years earlier, the apartment had been small. A 1-bedroom in East Atlanta with thin walls and a radiator that clanged all winter, but Asha had made it home. She'd hung sheer curtains to soften the harsh light, filled mason jars with flowers from the farmer's market, and somehow made their second-hand furniture feel cozy rather than shabby. Darius could still remember coming home from 18-hour days at his startup to find her curled up on their thrift store couch, grading papers from her 3rd grade class by lamplight. She'd look up when he walked in, tired but smiling, and ask about his day like his struggles mattered more than her own exhaustion. Each he'd say, pushing a plate toward him, even though he knew she'd been living on ramen and peanut butter sandwiches to make their grocery budget stretch. "You're too skinny, baby. Can't have my brilliant husband wasting away while he changes the world." Those had been the hardest years, when PropTech was just an idea and a dream, when Darius was coding 16 hours a day and pitching to investors who barely looked up from their phones. Asha had worked 2 jobs, teaching during the day and tutoring kids at night, to keep them afloat. She'd pack him lunches in brown paper bags, with little notes tucked inside. "You've got this," or "One day closer to your dream," or simply "I love you," in her careful teacher's handwriting. When the first major investment came through, when PropTech finally gained traction, and the money started flowing, Darius thought the hard part was over. He thought they'd made it through the valley together and could finally enjoy the mountaintop. He'd been wrong about what the hard part would be. Success changed everything, but so gradually that neither of them noticed until it was too late. The networking events that had once been exciting opportunities became obligations. The apartment that had been their sanctuary became too small, too ordinary, for a man who was being profiled in Atlanta Business Chronicle. The friends who had sustained him through the lean years began to feel like anchors dragging him down from the heights he was trying to reach. Asha tried to keep up. She bought new dresses for the charity galas, learned to make small talk with investors. Wives smiled through dinner parties, where the conversation centered around vacation homes and private schools. But teaching third grade in a Title I school didn't exactly prepare someone for discussions about wine futures and art auctions. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she told him one night after a particularly brutal evening at a tech industry mixer. She was sitting on the edge of their new king-size bed in their new house in Buckhead, still in the cocktail dress that had cost more than her monthly salary, crying quietly. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be in this world you're building." Darius had been checking emails on his phone, already thinking about the morning's investor meeting. "You're supposed to be yourself, Ash. You're supposed to be happy for us. Are you happy for us? Or are you happy for you?" The question had stung because he couldn't answer it honestly. The truth was that he loved the life he was building, loved being Darius Kingsley, founder and CEO, loved the respect and recognition that came with success. But he was starting to feel suffocated by the remnants of who he used to be, including the woman who remembered when he'd been just a broke kid with big dreams and calloused hands. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming fights or thrown dishes, no affairs or betrayals in the traditional sense. Just a slow, painful drift toward separate lives under the same roof. Darius worked later and later, traveled more frequently, found reasons to stay out for drinks with colleagues or potential clients. Asha retreated into herself, spending longer hours at school, taking on extra responsibilities with her students' families, building a life that didn't depend on him. The divorce papers were filed on a Tuesday. Asha had presented them to him calmly already, signed over coffee at their granite kitchen island. "I'm not asking for anything," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know you work for all this. I can't keep pretending I belong in it." He'd signed without argument, told himself it was for the best, that they'd simply grown in different directions. He'd even convinced himself he was being noble by not fighting her decision, by making the process as painless as possible. What he hadn't done was ask where she was going, how she would manage, or whether she needed anything from him beyond a signature on legal documents. He'd assumed, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never truly worried about money, that she would figure it out, that her teaching salary would be enough, that someone as capable as Asha would land on her feet. Now, standing in his wedding reception, the taste of champagne sour in his mouth, Darius realized how wrong he'd been about everything. How wrong he'd been about what mattered, about what he'd lost, about the cost of the life he'd chosen. He pushed through the crowd toward the kitchen, his heart pounding with each step. Behind him, someone was tapping a glass, calling for another toast. The sound felt like it was coming from another universe. He found her by the service elevator, loading dirty dishes onto a cart. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, the way her uniform hung loose everywhere except over her rounded belly. She was thinner than he remembered, except for the baby, and something about that made his chest tight with shame. "Asha." She didn't look up. "Congratulations on your wedding, Darius. Your wife is lovely. Why are you here?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended. She finally met his eyes, and he saw something in them he'd never seen before. Not sadness or anger, but a kind of weary strength that made him feel very small. "Because I needed the money," she said simply. "Some of us don't get the luxury of forgetting the past." The words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to ask about the baby, about how she'd ended up working catering jobs while pregnant, about 100 other things. But before he could find his voice, she was pushing her cart toward the service elevator, disappearing from his perfect wedding just as quietly as she'd appeared. Chapter 3. The test and the truth. The days following the wedding passed in a blur of thank you notes and honeymoon preparations, but Darius couldn't shake the image of Asha from his mind. He found himself distracted during client meetings, staring out the window of his corner office, calculating dates and timelines in his head. If the baby was his, and the timing suggested it might be, she would have found out she was pregnant just weeks after their divorce was finalized. The thought of her receiving that news alone in whatever small apartment she'd moved to after leaving their Buckhead house made him physically sick. Against his better judgment, he hired a private investigator. Not to intrude on her privacy, he told himself, but just to make sure she was okay, to understand her situation. What the man reported back made Darius's carefully constructed new life feel like a house of cards in a hurricane. Asha was living in a studio apartment in Kirkwood, working 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet. The catering company substitute teaching when available and weekend shifts at a local bookstore. She had no family in Atlanta and no support system beyond a few teacher friends who were struggling just as hard as she was. Her landlord had already served her 1 eviction notice, which she'd managed to fight off with a partial payment and a promise to catch up. She was 6 months pregnant and essentially homeless. Darius sat in his BMW in the parking lot of her apartment complex, a rundown building with cracked sidewalks and broken streetlights, holding the investigator's report and shaking hands. This was where she'd ended up while he was planning a wedding that cost more than most people made in a year. He tried calling her, but she wouldn't answer. When he knocked on her door, she spoke to him through the chain lock. "I don't want your help, Darius. I don't want your money or your guilt or whatever this is. Just tell me," he said, his forehead pressed against the cheap wood of her door. "Is the baby mine?" The silence stretched so long he thought she'd walked away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, but that doesn't make you a dad." The words cut deeper than any anger could have. He tried to arrange anonymous help. Grocery deliveries, medical bills paid through a third party, an envelope of cash slipped under her door. Everything came back to him. The groceries returned to the store with a note, "I know it's you." The medical bills remained unpaid. The cash was mailed back to his office with no explanation. She was too proud to accept charity from a man who had abandoned her, too strong to let him ease his conscience with money. But she was also too stubborn to let him help in any meaningful way, and that stubbornness was going to put both her and his child at risk. 3 weeks after the wedding, Darius finally caught her leaving the bookstore, where she worked weekend shifts. She was moving slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, her face pale with exhaustion. "Asha, please. Just 5 minutes." She stopped but didn't turn around. "What do you want me to say, Darius? That I forgive you? That I understand why you had to choose between me and the life you wanted? I don't understand how someone I loved could just disappear. I never meant for this to happen." She turned then, and he saw tears on her cheeks. "You never meant for me to get pregnant, or you never meant to get caught carrying. I never meant to hurt you, but you did." Her voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. "You left me when I needed you most, and now you want to come back when it's convenient for you, when you can be the hero swooping in to save the day. I want to help. Let me help. I don't need you to help. I need you to have been there when it mattered." She turned away again. "I need you to have been the man I thought I married." As she walked away, her steps careful on the uneven pavement, Darius realized that money and good intentions weren't going to be enough. Nothing he could do now would change the fact that when Asha had needed him most, when she'd been facing pregnancy alone, scrambling to make rent, choosing between groceries and prenatal vitamins, he'd been planning his wedding to another woman. Some betrayals couldn't be fixed with grand gestures or heartfelt apologies. Some damage cut too deep for healing. But their child deserved better than a father who only showed up when guilt became unbearable. And maybe if he could find a way to prove that he'd learned something from his mistakes, there might still be hope for redemption. Chapter 4. The Break and the Reckoning. The end of Darius's second marriage began with a TM-style blog post titled "Scandal at Atlanta's Wedding of the Year," accompanied by a blurry cell phone photo of a pregnant woman in catering attire. The blogger, who covered Atlanta society events, had pieced together enough information to ask dangerous questions. Who was the mystery woman? Why did the groom look so shaken after speaking with her? And most damaging of all, Why did she look so familiar to those who remembered Darius Kingsley's previous marriage? Alina confronted him that evening in their Buckhead mansion, still wearing her tennis whites from the country club, her face tight, with the kind of controlled fury that came from growing up in political families. "I know about the catering woman," she said, without preamble, dropping the printed blog post on his desk. "I know it's your ex-wife. And I know she's pregnant." Darius looked up from his laptop, where he'd been pretending to review quarterly reports while actually Googling prenatal care costs and apartment listings in safer neighborhoods. "Alina, is it yours?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. In their 18 months together, Alina had never been one for emotional confrontations. Their relationship had been built on mutual benefit: his tech fortune and her political connections, his need for respectability, and her need for independence from her father's political machine. Love had been a nice bonus, not a foundation. "Yes," he said, because lying seemed pointless now. She sat down across from him, her movements precise and controlled. "I see. And when were you planning to tell me? Before or after the baby was born?" "I didn't know until the wedding. I swear to you I had no idea. But you knew something was wrong. You've been different since that night. Distracted. Guilty." She studied his face with the analytical gaze she'd learned from years of watching her father read political opponents. "You're still in love with her." It wasn't a question, and Darius found he couldn't deny it. "I never stopped." The admission hung between them like a grenade with its pin pulled. Alina nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already known. "Well," she said finally, "at least now I understand why our honeymoon felt like a business trip." "Alina, I'm sorry. I never meant to get caught." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Darius, we both know this marriage was never a love story. It was a merger. But even mergers require good faith, and you've been operating in bad faith since our wedding day." She was right, and they both knew it. Their marriage had been the culmination of careful networking. Her father needed tech industry credibility for his upcoming gubernatorial campaign. Darius needed the social respectability that came with marrying into old Georgia political money. Love had developed between them, but it had always felt optional, a pleasant side effect, rather than the main event. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to fix this before it becomes a scandal that destroys both our families." Her voice was crisp, businesslike. "I want you to take care of your responsibilities quietly and completely. And then I want you to decide whether you can actually be married to me, or if you need to go chase whatever it is you think you lost." She stood up, smoothing her tennis skirt with automatic precision. "I'll be staying at Daddy's place while you figure things out. My lawyer will be in touch about the prenup if you decide to make this a permanent arrangement." After she left, Darius sat alone in their enormous house, 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen they'd never cooked in, and felt the weight of his choices settling around him like debris from an explosion. He'd built exactly the life he thought he wanted, and it was collapsing around him because he'd never examined the foundation. The next morning he drove to Asha's apartment complex again. This time he didn't call ahead or knock on her door. He just sat in his car and watched, trying to understand how his life had led him to surveilling his pregnant ex-wife from a parking lot. She emerged around noon, moving even more slowly than before, dressed in scrubs that suggested she was picking up a shift at the medical temp agency. Her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, took 3 tries to start. When she stopped at a red light, he got out of his BMW and approached her passenger window. She saw him coming and rolled it down a few inches. "I left her," he said without preamble. Asha stared at him for a long moment. "Congratulations. Do you want a cookie?" "I want to help. I want to do right by you and the baby. You want to assuage your guilt so you can sleep at night." The light turned green. Cars behind her began to honk. Maybe, he admitted, but the baby still needs a father. The baby needs a father who shows up because he wants to, not because he has to. She started to roll up the window, then stopped. "You can't just decide to care now, Darius. It doesn't work that way." But as the days passed, he kept showing up anyway. Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with presence. When she came home from her evening catering shift, he was there to carry her work bag. When she ran out of prenatal vitamins, he left a bottle by her door with no note attached. When her neighbor called to say Asha had collapsed on her way up the stairs, he was there in 15 minutes. You don't get to be the hero in this story, she told him as he helped her to her couch, her legs swollen and her breathing labored. I know, he said, fetching ice packs for her ankles. I'm not trying to be the hero. I'm trying to be present. Why now? Why not when I was crying myself to sleep in this apartment, wondering how I was going to afford to eat and pay rent in the same month? The question hit him like a physical blow because he couldn't answer it without admitting the truth, that he hadn't cared enough to find out how she was struggling, that he'd been too busy building his perfect life to wonder what had happened to the woman who'd helped him build the foundation for it. Because I was a coward, he said finally. Because it was easier to tell myself you were fine than to face what I'd done to you. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that his presence here wasn't just about guilt or obligation. I can't do this with you if you're going to disappear again, she said quietly. I can't survive being abandoned twice. I won't disappear. Promise me. Not just that you'll stick around for the good parts, but that you'll be here for the 3 a.m. feedings and the colic and the diaper blowouts and all the parts of parenting that aren't Instagram-worthy. I promise. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the couch cushions. We'll see. Chapter 5. The birth of promise, the change the call, came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Darius was lying awake in his empty Buckhead house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the custody arrangement his lawyer had drafted when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Kingsley? This is Rosa Mendez. I'm Asha's neighbor. She's in labor, and she asked me to call you. By the time he reached her apartment, Rosa was helping Asha down the stairs, one careful step at a time. Asha was breathing heavily, pausing every few steps to grip the railing as contractions washed over her. She looked so small in her oversized t-shirt and yoga pants, so vulnerable that Darius felt something crack open in his chest. The hospital she managed between breaths. Grady Memorial. The drive through empty Atlanta streets was surreal. Traffic lights blinking yellow, the city sleeping, while his world transformed. Asha sat beside him, focused inward, breathing through contractions, with a determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She was facing this enormous moment with the same quiet strength she'd brought to everything else, even when he'd left her to face it alone. At the hospital, everything moved in a controlled rush. Wheelchairs and paperwork, insurance cards and medical histories, nurses who spoke in calm professional tones, while Darius's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt utterly useless, relegated to filling out forms, while Asha was whisked away for examination and monitoring. Are you the father? A nurse asked, and the simple question nearly brought him to his knees. Yes, he said, the word carrying the weight of months of doubt and guilt and fear. Labor lasted 14 hours. Darius learned things about himself he'd never known, that he could hold someone's hand through pain without trying to fix it, that he could be present for something he couldn't control, that love sometimes meant sitting quietly in uncomfortable hospital chairs and waiting for life to unfold on its own timeline. Asha was magnificent throughout, fierce and focused, and completely in command of her own experience. She didn't want him coaching her breathing or offering reassurances he wasn't qualified to give. She just wanted him there, a steady presence in the room, proof that this time she wasn't facing the hardest thing alone. When their son finally arrived, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a perfect crown of dark hair and lungs that announced his displeasure with the world in no uncertain terms, Darius wept like he'd never wept before. Not the careful, controlled emotion he'd learned to display in professional settings, but raw, overwhelming joy mixed with relief and terror, and something that felt like coming home. He's beautiful, he whispered, accepting the baby from the nurse, with hands that shook. The child was impossibly small, impossibly perfect, impossibly his. He's so beautiful, Ash. Asha was exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, her face flushed and radiant. Michael, she said softly. His name is Michael. Michael David Kingsley Blake, according to the birth certificate. A hyphenated name that represented compromise, shared responsibility, a future that neither of them could yet imagine, but were committed to building together. Darius stayed all night, sleeping fitfully in the bedside chair, while Asha and Michael rested. When the baby cried at 3 a.m., Darius was the one who picked him up, changed his diaper, with fumbling hands walked him around the small room until he settled. When the nurses came for morning, Checks they found him holding his son against his chest, both of them sleeping peacefully. He's a natural, one of the nurses told Asha, who watched from her hospital bed, with an expression Darius couldn't quite read. After they brought Michael home to Asha's studio apartment, Darius fell into a routine he'd never expected to want. He arrived every morning before Asha woke up, bringing coffee and groceries, and whatever help she'd accept. He learned to change diapers and mix formula to swaddle a squirming infant and interpret different types of cries. He took parenting classes at the local community center, read books about child development, researched the best pediatricians in the city. Most importantly, he learned to be present without expecting anything in return. He didn't push for reconciliation or make grand speeches about second chances. He simply showed up day after day, proving that his promise to stay wasn't just words. One afternoon, exhausted from a night of colic-induced crying, Asha dozed off on the couch while Darius fed Michael his bottle. When she woke up an hour later, she found them both asleep in the recliner. Darius with his head back and mouth slightly open, Michael curled against his father's chest, tiny fingers gripping Darius's shirt. Something in her chest tightened at the sight. This was the man she'd loved, the one who'd held her during thunderstorms and built her bookshelves and promised to love her through whatever came. Somewhere along the way to success, she'd lost him to ambition and social climbing and the intoxicating drug of other people's approval. But maybe, this version of him, the one who showed up at 2 a.m. for diaper changes and fell asleep holding his son, was who he'd always been underneath. Maybe the man she'd married was still there, just buried under years of trying to become someone else. She didn't wake them. Instead, she pulled a blanket over both of them and let herself hope, just for a moment, that some stories could have second beginnings. Final chapter. A new family, a second beginning. 6 months after Michael's birth, Darius asked if he could take them to dinner. Not to make a statement or prove a point, but because he missed talking to Asha about things that mattered. He missed her laugh, her perspective on the world, the way she could find hope in the smallest victories. Not fancy, he promised when she hesitated. Just that place on Memorial Drive we used to go to. Mary's Kitchen. Mary's was exactly as they remembered. Vinyl booths with duct-tape tiers, fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally, and the best fried chicken and cornbread in Atlanta. The kind of place where the waitresses called everyone honey, and the sweet tea came in mason jars, where success was measured in satisfied customers rather than Yelp reviews. They sat in their old booth by the window, Michael sleeping in his carrier between them, and for the first time in years, they talked like friends. Not ex-spouses navigating custody arrangements or co-parents discussing pediatrician appointments, but two people who had once shared dreams and fears and lazy Sunday mornings. "Remember when you used to bring your laptop here to work?" Asha asked, watching him cut his chicken with the same methodical precision she remembered. "You'd order coffee after coffee and make notes on napkins because you couldn't afford a notebook." Darius smiled, the memory bittersweet. "You'd grade papers at the same table while I coded. The waitresses thought we were the broke college couple who'd never amount to anything. Maybe they were right about one of those things." "Which one?" "We were broke." She took a sip of sweet tea, considering. "But we were also happy. I think I forgot that success could look different than what we achieved." They talked about Michael, about the way he was starting to smile and track objects with his eyes, about whether he'd inherited Darius's mathematical mind or Asha's love of stories. They talked about her return to teaching. She'd found a position at a charter school that offered childcare and understood the realities of single motherhood. They talked about his work, about the foundation he was starting to provide technology resources to underserved schools. They didn't talk about what they were to each other now or what they might become. Some conversations were too fragile for definitions. As they prepared to leave, Asha reached across the table and touched his hand. "I need you to know something," she said. "I didn't lose you to another woman. I lost you to the man you thought you had to become." Darius turned his hand, palm up, catching her fingers in his. "I'm trying to be the man I should have been when you were by my side." She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. "I know you are. But I need to know that this version of you, the one who shows up for midnight feedings and pediatrician appointments and conversations about nothing important, I need to know he's real. Not just guilt or obligation, but who you actually are." "He's real," Darius said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. He's who I was before I convinced myself I needed to be someone else. They walked to their cars, slowly, Michael awake now and looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity of a six-month-old discovering the world. In the parking lot, under the soft glow of streetlights, Asha let Darius take the baby carrier while she fished for her keys. "Same time next week?" he asked, not wanting the evening to end. "If you want." "I want." She smiled, and the first unreserved smile he'd seen from her since before their divorce. "Okay, but next time you're buying dessert." 3 months later, they were at Piedmont Park on a Saturday afternoon, watching Michael practice the art of crawling on a blanket while other families played around them. Spring was everywhere, dogwood trees blooming white and pink, the sound of children's laughter mixing with distant music from someone's radio, the warm sun making everything feel possible. Michael was determined to reach a dandelion just beyond the edge of their blanket, his chubby arms and legs working furiously to propel himself forward. Darius lay on his stomach beside his son, offering encouragement and making sure he didn't eat anything inappropriate. "Come on, buddy," he coaxed. "You've got this." Just a little further. Asha watched them from her spot on the blanket, these two males who shared her heart in different ways. Michael finally reached his goal, grasping the dandelion with a triumphant squeal before immediately trying to put it in his mouth. Darius gently redirected him toward a safer toy, and the baby accepted the substitution with the easy resilience of someone who hadn't yet learned that disappointment was supposed to hurt. "He's going to walk before he's won," Asha observed, pulling Michael into her lap for a snuggle. "Look at that determination. He gets that from his mother," Darius said, sitting up and brushing grass off his shirt. "The stubborn refusal to give up. I gave up on us." The words came out quietly, almost lost in the sounds of the park around them. Darius looked at her sharply, but she was focused on Michael, who was now attempting to grab her earrings. "You didn't give up. I pushed you away. I could have fought harder. Could have made you see what you were throwing away." She lifted Michael up, making him giggle with delight. "But I was tired, Darius. Tired of feeling like I wasn't enough for the life you wanted to build. You were everything I needed. I was just too stupid to realize it." She looked at him, then this man who had broken her heart, and was now trying to piece it back together with patience and presence and the thousand small acts of love that made up daily life with a child. "Maybe some stories don't start with love," she said softly, watching Michael's face light up as he reached for a butterfly that danced just out of his grasp. "Maybe they earn it in the middle." Darius moved closer on the blanket, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Are we earning it?" Asha leaned into him slightly, letting herself enjoy the solid warmth of his presence, the way Michael relaxed when both his parents were near. Around them, the park hummed with life, families building memories on playground equipment, couples walking hand in hand, teenagers playing frisbee with the careless joy of people who still believed the future held infinite possibilities. "Maybe," she said finally. "Ask me again in a year." "I will," he promised, and she believed him. Not because he'd never broken a promise before, but because this version of him, the one who had learned that love was a verb rather than a feeling, who understood that showing up was more important than having all the answers, this version of him kept his word. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the park began to empty, they packed up their small collection of baby gear and walked toward the parking lot. Michael had fallen asleep in his stroller, exhausted from his adventures in grass and sunshine, one tiny fist clutching the toy dandelion Darius had bought him from a vendor. "Thank you," Asha said as they reached her car. "For what?" "For proving that people can change. For showing me that the man I fell in love with was still in there somewhere." She touched his cheek, gently, the gesture both familiar and new. "For giving me hope that some endings are actually beginnings." Darius caught her hand, pressing it briefly against his face before letting it go. "Thank you for giving me the chance to try again. For letting me learn how to be the father Michael deserves and the man you needed me to be." They loaded Michael into his car seat with the practiced efficiency of parents who had learned to work as a team even if they weren't sure what kind of team they were yet. As Asha started her car, Darius leaned down to her window. "Same time next Saturday." "Same time next Saturday," she confirmed. He watched them drive away, his son and the woman who had loved him before he knew how to love himself, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the sharp, hungry satisfaction of professional success or social approval, but the quiet joy of being exactly where he belonged with exactly the people who mattered most. The story wasn't over. There would be more conversations, more moments of doubt, and discovery, more nights when Michael's crying tested their patience, and days when old hurts surfaced despite their best intentions. Love Darius was learning wasn't a destination, but a daily choice, a commitment to showing up even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. But for now, standing in the golden light of a Georgia evening with grass stains on his jeans and the sound of his son's laughter still echoing in his ears, Darius understood something he'd spent years trying to learn. Success wasn't measured in stock options or society page mentions or the size of your house in Buckhead. Success was measured in moments like these. A baby's first crawl toward a dandelion, an ex-wife's tentative smile, the possibility of redemption offered not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of ordinary days, lived with extraordinary care. Some stories, he realized, were worth waiting for. Some love was worth earning twice.